shall we talk about the representation of Asians in Hollywood then? I am Asian American and am of Chinese descent. My cultural upbringing was more Western though because I was adopted when I was 18 months old and brought to America. So as Aquafina would put it, I'm a
banana. Yellow on the outside and white on the inside.
There has been a lot of progress involving the topic of Asian representation in Hollywood, but there have been choices made in Hollywood that have either underrepresented Asian Americans or inaccurately depicted them in Hollywood cinema. Hollywood has produced movies that encourage Asian erasure and whitewashing of Asian characters. Asian erasure is basically the concept of Asians being completely erased from films in Hollywood. I was unaware of the specific concept involved in Hollywood until I found a video published by PBS Idea Channel. Link in the description. This video is definitely worth watching. I'm going to primarily be focusing on whitewashing in Hollywood though, just because I believe that's more of an issue presently, and it's something that I've been aware of more than the concept of Asian erasure in my lifetime. Whitewashing is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's the concept of taking characters that should be played by Asians and then casting a white actor or actress to play those originally created Asian characters. According to the Hollywood Diversity Report of 2020, it states that in 2019, Asians only represented 5% of film roles in Hollywood. Asians are grossly underrepresented compared to the 67.3% of representation of Caucasian film roles. With that said though, according to the same report, people of color collectively have claimed a slightly larger share of all top film roles that would seem to be increasing. From 2018 to 2019, representation of people of color has increased from 31% to 32.7%, which isn't a huge number, but it's significant because it means there's change happening. Examples of films that did not accurately represent Asians would be films like Ghost in the Shell, when Scarlett Johansson was casted as a character who was originally created as a Japanese anime film character. This is an example of whitewashing Hollywood. It's interesting though because I watched the PBS Idea Channel video and apparently the filmmakers went to Japan and asked if people were offended by the fact that a white female actress was casted for an Asian character. The people they interviewed didn't care at all who played what, because they have representation of themselves in their own country. This highlights my plea for more Asian representation in America. In Asia, they have their own films and TV shows that are coming out that represent them. Representation is such an issue in Hollywood because America is so diverse. There is more of a demand for diversity in Hollywood because America is so incredibly diverse. People want to see themselves on the screen. Another example of whitewashing is Avatar: The Last Airbender. The cast isn't completely whitewashed, but to whitewash the main characters seems kind of insensitive. Though this movie has many issues, whitewashing was a pretty blatant downfall of this film. But apparently, Netflix is doing a live-action reboot of Avatar: The Last Airbender, but it seems to be low on gaining traction. I've recognized when watching various films is that they seem to have more accurate Asian representation when Asians are creating the movies. A film that I thought had a good balance of Asian representation and Caucasian representation was The Meg. This film is actually a US-China co-production, which accounts for the Chinese-speaking roles and Asian representation in the film. When I first watched this film, it blew my mind that the characters started speaking Mandarin.
你是爸爸这辈子最大的骄傲。爸爸做梦不想着美丽长大了能像你一样。
别说话了吧，我懂。
And a successful Hollywood film that featured these famous white actors. This is something that I would hope won't be such a huge shock to audiences in the near future. Hollywood has had a decently consistent track record of having successful films starring Asians being directed and created by Asians. Crazy Rich Asians had a fully Asian cast and was directed by John M. Chu. This movie went on to make $174 million in the US alone against a budget of $30 million, receiving a 91% on Rotten Tomatoes. Another successful example of Asian representation in TV is Fresh Off the Boat, another piece of media starring Constance Wu. Fresh Off the Boat is an ABC sitcom with 6 seasons and over 100 episodes. I'm currently watching the series on Hulu, and this show makes me laugh out loud every time, and it has a 94% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Speaking of Fresh Off the Boat, I also wanted to mention Randall Park's Jimmy Woo and how cool his character's been in Marvel's WandaVision. Speaking of the MCU, there has been a lot of great Asian characters, but yet to be any Asian leads in the MCU, which is gonna change with the release of Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, starring Simu Liu and Awkwafina. I'm beyond excited for this film. A film that I just recently watched was The Farewell, starring Awkwafina and directed by Lulu Wang. This film is such an interesting visual on how the Chinese culture deals with issues by taking it upon the family and carrying the type of burden that is your grandmother getting cancer together and as one unit. Having Awkwafina's character being more of Western idealism, having mostly grown up in the US, the comparison between the two cultures was more prevalent and really interesting to watch. They also spoke Chinese and English throughout the film, and that also blew my mind.
你到了吗？那检查结果拿
这个。 咋了？这写的啥呀？
我不知道，我不看中文，你没看吗？
俺不认识字儿，你没上过学。
带给。
The Farewell was nominated for Best Motion Picture, Foreign Language at the Golden Globes, and Awkwafina won Best Performance by an Actress in a Motion Picture, Musical, or Comedy. I don't know if I would have necessarily considered The Farewell a musical or a comedy, although there were some funny bits throughout the film, but Awkwafina still deserved that Golden Globe. Her performance was awesome. Despite these numbers and awards, only 1.5 out of 10 film directors are people of color. As of 2019, Asians only made up 3.4% of the directors in Hollywood in comparison to the 84.9% of white directors that make up Hollywood, which is better than the 2.8% of writers that are Asian. The percentage of Asian writers in Hollywood is kind of depressing when compared to the 86.1% of writers who are white in Hollywood. This is one way that Asian representation in Hollywood could grow, is by having more writers actually be Asian. I believe there'll be more diversity if the people creating the movies are actually Asian. A show that I love to watch with my family is the reboot of Hawaii Five-0. One of the coolest characters was Kono Kalakaua. I was really disappointed when I found out that Grace Park and Daniel Dae Kim would be leaving the show because they weren't getting paid as much as their white co-stars. Grace Park and Daniel Dae Kim were receiving 10 to 15% lower wages than their white co-stars Alex O'Loughlin and Scott Kane, despite being a part of this series for the same amount of time. According to CNBC, Daniel Dae Kim expresses his sadness over leaving the show, but is appreciative of being able to play a three-dimensional character like Chin-ho. He also includes the fact that the path to equality is rarely easy, but he hopes that we can be excited for the future. Despite the sad misuse of pay, there has been an increase in successful Asian films. Daniel Dae Kim is actually in Walt Disney Animation Studios' Raya and the Last Dragon, coming out on March 5th. This video is probably coming out after the 5th of March, but I haven't seen this movie yet, but it looks awesome. It features characters inspired by Southeast Asian culture, and it looks so cool. I'm looking forward to when Asians can be represented in film just as much as Caucasian actors and actresses, as well as being represented behind the camera.
I'm